to Bad at Goodbyes. Each week on our show, we spotlight species from the IUCN Critically Endangered Red List. These are plants and animals with decreasing populations, nearing the edges of extinction. We'll share species research, information, and conservation proposals. And then we'll spend a chunk of the show opening a space for contemplation and awe. We'll perform a soundscape of gentleness, reflection, and perhaps grieving. So there's a very low likelihood that any of these species will survive the 21st century. And so perhaps we might acknowledge their passage with a moment of our attention, recognition of our kinship, and with a commitment to personal and systemic change. Thank you for listening. On today's show, we consider the Bahama Nuthatch. The Bahama Nuthatch is a critically endangered avian native to the island of Grand Bahama in the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 60 miles east of the North American mainland off the southern Florida coast. The Bahama Nuthatch is one of the smallest nuthatches in the world, measuring about 4 inches in length, with a wingspan of about 8 inches, and weighing roughly 1/4 of an ounce. So this is like so tiny. It's about the size of a teacup, and weighs about the same as like 3 pennies. The Bahama Nuthatch has a brown head that extends kind of down to its nape with a dark brown eye stripe. Its upper parts are predominantly bluish gray, and then that shifts into like a chocolate brown at the wingtips. Its chest and belly are a pale white that's speckled with like a blue-gray. Its black bill is long, pointed, and it's slightly upturned, adapted for probing bark and crevices for the insects on which it feeds. Its tail is short and squared. Its legs and feet are dark gray, and its clawed toes are adapted for gripping bark. They're arranged in a zygodactyl pattern. Zygodactyl just means that there's 2 toes facing forward and 2 facing backward. And so this means that they can grip and climb up, down, and sideways on tree trunks, even moving like upside down. The Bahama Nuthatch is native to Grand Bahama Island in the Bahamas, and specifically to the pine yards. This is a region of Caribbean pine forests. The tropical and subtropical coniferous forest biome, populated with these pine trees in the overstory, and it's a warm and humid climate. The landscape itself is relatively flat, with occasional limestone outcrops and depressions that create variations in the terrain. And these depressions will sometimes hold seasonal ponds or like small marshes during the rainy season. The climate on Grand Bahama Island is subtropical, so warm temperatures, high humidity year-round. Summer temperatures typically reach highs in the 90s. Winter temperatures rarely drop below the mid-60s. The Bahama nuthatch shares its habitat with Bahama oriole, Bahama woodstar, poisonwood, Bahama trumpet tree, Florida clover ash, Bahama warbler, Cuban emerald hummingbird, boas, West Indian woodpecker, Bahama pine, thatch palm, buffy flower bat, devil's gut, Bahama yellowthroat, West Indian snowberry, rock iguana, southern bracken fern, bushy beard grass, Bahama swallow, and many, many more. The Bahama nuthatch is an obligate resident of these piney woodlands. Obligate resident means that the Bahama nuthatch is totally dependent on the Caribbean pine and these Caribbean pine forests for its survival. So for food, for safety from predation, and for reproduction and nesting. It cannot live anywhere else. The Bahama nuthatch forages for insects and seeds on all sections of the Caribbean pine, so trunk, branches, twigs, cones, spending most of its time feeding in the upper parts of the tree, roughly 40 feet above the forest floor. So it methodically moves up and down the trunk using its zygodactyl claws. It peels off loose bark and probes bark crevices, needle clusters, and open cones for seeds and for arthropods like spiders, beetles, roaches, and ants. With harder foods, like hard-shelled insects and the pine's seeds, the nuthatch will hammer repeatedly with its bill until the food is opened or like safe for consumption. It is this behavior that gives the nuthatch family its common name. It opens or hatches nuts to eat the kernel inside. Though it has not been directly observed in the Bahama nuthatch, its two closest relatives, the pygmy and the brown-headed nuthatch, are both documented tool users. So they'll use twigs held in their beaks as like a kind of crowbar to pry up bark to search for insects underneath, and then dropping the twig to feed when their prey is found. Given their close taxonomy, and that the Bahama nuthatch was thought, in fact, to be a subspecies of the brown-headed nuthatch until just 2021, I think that we can confidently hypothesize that the Bahama nuthatch is a tool user as well. Interestingly, the key studies that led to the establishment of the Bahama nuthatch as a distinct species were based on their vocalizations. The Bahama nuthatch communicates using a range of calls, charmingly described by ornithologists. Ornithologists are scientists who study birds. Described by ornithologists as chitters, twitters, pits, tinks, trills, and skidoos. And so in two separate 2020 studies, researchers played back recorded Bahama nuthatch calls to brown-headed nuthatch, and then vice versa, brown-headed nuthatch calls back to Bahama nuthatch. And then in both cases, acknowledgement and recognition of the calls was very low. And of course, like as a control, acknowledgement and recognition when the calls were played to their own species was very high. And so this behavioral difference in the lack of recognition of calls from the other species, along with evidence from genetic studies, led the American Ornithological Society to declare the Bahama nuthatch a distinct species just in 2021. Researcher David Pereira in 2018 recorded some of the Bahama nuthatch's vocalizations. So I'm going to drop the music out now, and we can take a listen. Communication is, of course, key for avian species, and research suggests that nuthatches in particular have really nuanced vocalizations. From a 2020 study of the red-breasted nuthatch, Nora Carlson, Eric Green, and Christopher Templeton found that the nuthatch use distinct alarm calls based on the source and quality of their information. They write, quote, "Inappropriate responses to a predator threat can be costly either by overestimating the degree of the threat, leading to wasted time and energy, or by underestimating the degree of the threat, leading to injury or death from the predator. Thus, natural selection should favor alarm calling systems in which signals reliably reflect the threat level of a potential predator, and the receivers assessing the quality of the source of the information and base their responses on their information quality," end quote. And so what that means, what this looks like, if a nuthatch observed an approaching predator, they would vocalize a particular alarm call. Alternatively, if they heard another nuthatch's alarm call but did not themselves see the threat, they would vocalize a slightly different call, indicating that they were like passing along information, that it was not like a direct observation. And also, the nuthatch will eavesdrop, and that's the scientific term, eavesdrop, on other birds in their habitat. So if another species raises an alarm call, a nuthatch that hears it will translate it. I know that's not the right word, but that's the idea. They'll translate it and then vocalize their own alarm call, but indicate in that call that the concern originated indirectly, from another species. So we're learning that these species are encoding substantive information in their vocalizations, and also that they are assessing what's called public information from other species in order to protect one another from predator threat. In the dream, at the end, the memory of sweet, downy fledglings chittering for food, of the Kirkland's warbler visiting each winter time, and thinking back far now to the mainland, to the pines, like a home stretching far past where we might ever adventure. And then the storms, the world enders. First, the next, and then the last. Sheltering against the impossible wind, an alarm muted in the swirling howl. An anxious goodbye, lost in the dream. Bahama Nuthatch mate and lay eggs from November to May. Each breeding season, they form monogamous breeding pairs, and it seems likely that these pairs last for multiple years, although we do not have enough evidence to say so for certain. Bahama Nuthatch are cavity nesters, and so they excavate holes in dead or decaying Caribbean pine trees. The female typically selects the nest site, and then both partners participate in excavating and modifying the hole. They line the nest with soft materials like pine needles, feathers, and bark fibers. After mating, the female lays a clutch of 3 to 5 eggs. Incubation lasts about 2 weeks, with the female incubating the eggs, like remaining on the nest, sitting on the eggs, and the male brings her food during this time. Upon hatching, both parents feed the newborns. The young fledge. Fledge just means leave the nest. After about 3 weeks, though they continued to rely on their family for protection and food for roughly another 2 to 3 weeks. The Bahama Nuthatch demonstrate cooperative breeding. So the family unit consists of the breeding pair, their offspring, and potentially one or more helpers. That's the scientific name for these individuals, helpers that are usually male offspring from previous broods who have yet to take a mate. And so these helpers assist with all aspects of raising the young, from feeding to protection to teaching foraging strategies. These juvenile Bahama Nuthatch reach reproductive maturity within about a year, but again, they may stay on with their parents, in this helper role, for 1 or 2 years before breeding themselves. We do not have enough information to determine average lifespan, but their closest relatives in the nuthatch family live roughly 5 years. Over the 20th century, the Bahama Nuthatch suffered a dramatic population decline due to habitat destruction and introduced predators. And so extensive logging of the Caribbean pine in the mid-20th century And then that was followed by land clearing for development. This significantly reduced the Bahama nuthatch's habitat. Additionally, the anthropogenic introduction, anthropogenic just means human-caused, the anthropogenic introduction of invasive predators like corn snakes, house cats, raccoons, and black rats have exacerbated the nuthatch's decline. And then very recently, human-induced climate change in the form of more frequent and severe hurricanes has pushed the Bahama nuthatch population to the very brink. In 2004, there were approximately 1,800 individuals on Grand Bahama Island. And then a series of hurricanes struck the Bahamas, felling the Caribbean pine and also sending saltwater storm surges inland, which damaged the pine yards that the nuthatch rely on for food and nesting. Afterwards, only 23 individuals were spotted in 2007. And then in the wake of Hurricane Matthew in 2016, surveys found no Bahama nuthatches. Observers did not find any of the bird. But then in 2018, a team of researchers led by Matthew Gardner and David Pereira, whose recording we heard earlier, spent 3 months trekking over 400 miles through the island's pine forests and did observe 6 individuals. But then in late summer 2019, the island was hit by Hurricane Dorian. This was a Category 5 hurricane, causing further damage to species habitat. We do not know if the Bahama nuthatch survived. As far as I could uncover from my internet research, no recent large-scale observational surveys have been initiated. And the bird is tiny and shy, and its habitat is relatively remote, so a very small population might still remain. But it's been 5 years. And the birder blogs and recent posts from local naturalists and national park volunteers suggest that the Bahama nuthatch may be extinct. The Bahama nuthatch was placed on the IUCN Critically Endangered Red List in 2018. And our most recent counts estimate its population is less than 10 individuals, and it may be extinct. Information for today's show about the Bahama nuthatch was compiled from the Journal of Caribbean Ornithology, Volume 24, Number 1, the Bahamas National Trust, Birds of the World from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Bulletin of the British Ornithologists Club, Volume 140, Number 4, from the IUCN, from Ornithological Monographs, Number 24, from Nature Communication, Volume 11, Number 526, sound recordings by David Pereira from Zeno Canto, Avian Conservation and Ecology, Volume 15, Issue 2, Article 15, and from Wikipedia. Before we turn to the music, I'd like to play another of David Pereira's recordings, as this could be like the very last audio capture of the Bahama Nuthatch. And so now I would like to perform some music. Hopes of opening a space to be in contemplation of the other beings with whom we share our fragile earth. I do want to say explicitly that this music is not intended to extract meaning from the Bahama Nuthatch, or place undue meaning upon that being. Instead, I want the music to be a vessel for my awe, and as a space to consider my own relationship to other life, and in particular life that may be extinct. And so I will build and sit the space of sound and awe and contemplation, and I warmly invite you to join me. I honor the life force of the Bahama Nuthatch. I will commit its name to my record. I will hope for it. I'm grateful to have shared time on our planet with this being, and I lament the ways in which I and my species have harmed and diminished the species. And so, in the name of the Bahama Nuthatch, I pledge to reduce my consumption, my carbon footprint, and my wastefulness. I pledge to acknowledge and attempt to address the costs of my actions and inactions. I pledge to resist the harm of any plant or animal kin or their habitat by individuals, corporations, and governments. I forever pledge my song to the witness and memory of all life, to a broad celebration of biodiversity, to the total liberation of all beings. This has been Bad at Goodbyes. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for listening. Until next time, let's take care of each other and all of our kin.